In 2014, I was working at a cabinet shop here in South Florida. One day I was alone in the shop making cabinets, and I took the opportunity to record some footage of me working. I figured I'd use the footage sometime in the future. I already had a YouTube channel dedicated to music since 2006.
It's a sweet short song, so you tell us what the changes are. Alright, we're ready to go.
Even though this was not music related, I figured I could use some clips for Facebook, as I enjoyed, documenting life, as all people do just about nowadays. Most of my work at home was repairs and just general handyman projects, and that was from 2009 to 2014. And for social media, I was kind of focused on making music and music videos during that era. Back in 2014, or maybe earlier, I did watch videos of people making things. I saw a lot of makers, but one day I ran across the video of a guy using a chainsaw to cut up a log, and he turned it into a wedding chest. That was back in 2014, and it was a Duresta video. It was that video that inspired me to think about making things as another avenue for a creative output. At the time, I had a falling out in a relationship and totally lost my music-making mojo. This video helped shine a little path that I could explore without digging into emotions, as music requires one to do. So I opened up a new YouTube channel in 2015, Escagedo Woodworking, which I currently renamed Rockin' Woodworks, a channel name idea that Steve Neelan came up with that merges both my main interests, woodworking, and music making. The first video I made for my new channel was a candle holder centerpiece for a dining table. Next, I made a jewelry armoire. Then I did a handyman video, outdoor patio drainage. And so it went on with video after video of projects, and the list of things I was making just kept growing, with furniture, crafts, conversation pieces, decor, and more. At that time, I was also doing flea markets and craft shows in parking lots here in Miami with the help from my girlfriend at the time. Around that time, I struck up a friendship with Shogun Jimmy.
Hi, I'm Shogun Jimmy.
I can't remember if I ran into his channel or vice versa, but I remember being the first, if not one of the first comments on his new shop video. Shogun was very much interested in collaborations at the time, and in fact went on to do many collaborations with a whole host of makers as the years went on. But at the time he was fresh on the scene, as was I, and he proposed we do a collab. I was reluctant to do collabs and was used to working on my own. In fact, I had no interest in community activities and did not see value in it. But Shogun did. And out of friendship and motivation from him, I decided to collab with him on a skull challenge. Jimmy said that he needed to wrap up a challenge he was currently doing with Kinderhook Woodcraft before we could do our challenge, and that's how I met Kinderhook Woodcraft. Mike and I, well, we became good friends, chatting back and forth, and even spoke on the phone a few times. It was at that time that Mike said that he would like to have me join a private group on Facebook. He said a lot of the makers that we see on YouTube were there, and that it was a fun community, that shared pictures of their builds, answering questions. Just a great group comprised of a lot of the maker channels that we see on YouTube, so I was happy to join. Mike requested the group admin, Aragon, of Refined Industrial for me to join, and I was approved in 2016. As Mike had said to me, all the makers were there. It was a very creative group, and there was a lot of inspiration. It was just amazing. I met a lot of friends there, like JP Woodwork, Jerry Blakesley, William Lutz, Rick Wilkie, Andy Berkey, Tim Sway, Phil Pinsky, Red Smith, Patrick's Workshop, Doc Jared Hildebrandt, The Woodworking Junkie, Ray Pena, Paul Granger, David Gagne, Sterling Davis, Richard Martin, Paul Mormile, Mark Shee, Ollie Boykin, Tony Rouleau, Frank Schneider, Steve French, Robert Evans, Mike Gagger, Tommy Hovington, Mike Grimm, The Reaper, Matthew Fredericks, Pat Lapp, and just so many more. I would have to write a book from the list of good friends and just awesome people and the back and forth conversations. Back on YouTube, and during that time, I was also a big fan of Dan the Maker Man. Now, he was amazing. His videos were inspiring, and I was just blown away by his work. In 2016, Dan did an interview on Ryan Bitter's channel, Waylight Creations. I watched the interview, and at the end, Ryan would always ask his guests if they had any channel shout-outs that they would recommend. And I was blown away at the end of the interview when Dan the Makerman recommended my channel. After that interview, Ryan Bitters reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in doing an interview myself, and I was honored to do it and agreed. Ryan and I became good friends, and at some point around 2016, I requested him, Shogun Jimmy, and eventually Dan the Makerman to be added as members to the private group run by Andrew Aragon. Dan was the only reluctant one. Similar to SDM Custom, Dan liked his privacy but eventually agreed to join, and I introduced his name for the membership. Early on, when I joined the group, Jamie Page, aka JP Woodwork, was very welcoming to me, and he kind of picked up on my love of the Beatles. So he lived in Margate in England, and one day he said he would be traveling to London and would do a live on Facebook and visit Abbey Road for me.
Hello everybody. Anyone seen Eloy this morning? Been trying to get hold of him. He's the reason I'm here. I'm alright, mate. Not too bad. I'm trying to get hold of Eloy Escagedo. He's the reason I'm at Abbey Road at the moment. And here's something I bet Eloy would never see before. Look at that. His name outside Abbey Road Studios.
I thought that was just about the coolest thing in the world, and, we became really good friends. Also in 2016, I was invited to do the Maritime Makers Show with Matt Brander as the host, along with his friends Chris Cute, Jason McGinn, and others. I brought Rick Wilkie, Ryan Bitters, Shogun Jimmy for the panel. Now, Rick Wilkie was an amazing maker, and we met on the Facebook group and would often comment back and forth, and we kind of shared a lot of the same humor. We later would go on to start a podcast called Scratched, by the way. I also met Doc Jared Hildebrandt on that Maritime Makers Show. Doc had a really awesome shop that reminded me of Jimmy DeResta's basement shop in New York City. And not only that, but Doc seemed to look a lot like DeResta too. Ryan Bitters had a maker friend that he suggested I check out. His name was Matthew Haas. Ryan said I should check out his work, which I did, and thought he was just daring, very inspirational, and with a touch of that retro 80s vibe. Well, Matt and Ryan were working on an idea for a podcast at that time. The idea would be to feature makers, and hosts would each have comments on videos shared, and that's how the podcast would be, right? With an audience. It would be recorded live on YouTube and then edited and put out as a polished video. So Matt and Ryan asked me to co-host with them, and I agreed. The show was called Made by Nation. Made by Nation was a lot of fun, but eventually Matt, Ryan, and I decided to end the show as our lives were getting a bit busy and the views seemed to be steady but not really growing. We figured for the amount of work it was best to retire the series. Now, this didn't stop either Matt or Ryan from coming up with a multitude of projects and shows as the years went on. This was a time of constant creativity in the maker community, and these two were just batching out a lot of interactive ideas. On one occasion, Ryan and I were brainstorming on Hangouts, and we came up with the idea to create the Makers Rock album collab. Matt Haas of Awesome Wood Things was brought in immediately, and we continued further on with the brainstorming, and we brought Shogun Jimmy in as well.
I'm Shogun Jimmy.
Eventually the collab grew, and many makers would come in and participate, and it's still around to this day. In fact, Matt kept the collab alive all these years, where the rest of us would participate occasionally. The exception to that is Steve Carmichael, a founding member of the rock album collab. As Made by Nation was winding down, Ryan and Wilkie were already making plans for a new podcast. The idea was it would be a podcast about nothing. And that's exactly what they told me when we held a meeting and I was asked to join the team. So Rick Wilkie, Ryan Bitters, and I began the podcast Scratched. A podcast about nothing. Years later, Wilkie would leave the podcast and consequently drop out of sight from social media. Without Rick, Ryan and I were kind of done with Scratched. Now, it wasn't until a year later that Ryan and Doc started talks behind the scenes and reached out to Brian Bales and I to give the podcast a second season. By the way, during the podcast's first run, we were picked up by Podvader of Blog Talk Radio and given the royal treatment. We were given all the perks Blog Talk had to offer for free, and just for them hosting the show on their platform. But even that was not enough to keep the first incarnation of Scratched alive in the end. So the second incarnation of Scratched featured Ryan, Doc, Bales, and I. We went on for a good amount of episodes, and then Ryan decided to pull the plug and left the group. It was then that Rory May of Dirty Smith joined the podcast, filling the vacant space left by Ryan, and that started the third incarnation of Scratched. During the second season, Ryan came up with the idea of turning Scratched into a network and asked Bales, Doc, and I to come up with podcasts of our own to add to the roster. Out of that endeavor came Hella 90s with Mike Loing and Ryan Bitters. And then, of course, Trampled Underfoot podcast with Mark Lindsay and I. I had seen Mark Lindsay online in the past, and his logo was a memorable one. He had seen a video of Javi and I at his office shooting the breeze, and it may have been a live video or something, but Javi of Javi's workshop had a Mark Lindsay CNC mug in his office, and I recognized it, mentioned it in the video, and, we got to talking on Hangouts, and Mark would suggest we start a podcast, and the opportunity came when Scratched was looking for more content. I brought the idea to Mark, and he agreed, and that's how Trampled Underfoot podcast got its start. Now, sometime around 2016, 2017, a lot of makers were chatting on Google Hangouts. Jamie Page would often post a Hangout link in one of the Facebook groups, and makers would just, join in the afternoons and evenings. It's through these Hangouts that I met a lot of makers. Too many to name, really, but people like Patrick's Workshop, Billy McCord, Greg, Snow Crusher, Mark Saunders, Miter Mike, Chad from Mancrafting, and just many others. One late night evening, Jerry Blakesley sent me a message asking if I was around and asked me to come in to the Hangouts. He wanted me to meet someone. And that someone was Javi of Javi's Workshop.
How's it going?
Jerry left the Hangout soon after, and Javi and I talked for a few hours after that. Javi lived just a few short miles from me here in Miami. Sometime in March of 2017, there was going to be a woodworking show in Atlanta. Jamie Page was coming over to America all the way from England and would hitch a ride with Mark Saunders on an epic road trip all the way down to the Florida Keys. Along the way, they would stop at my house and stay the evening. During the show in Atlanta, Chad from Mancrafting made a video at a get-together at Joel Crawford's house. He went around filming makers, wishing me a happy birthday, but with a twist.
Did you say happy birthday to Eli?
Sure. Wait, Escagedo?
Yeah, Escagedo.
Yeah, no way.
Okay.
No way.
Would you like to say happy birthday to Eli?
Who's Eli?
Eli, yes. No. Would you like to say happy birthday to Eli?
Galoko, no.
Happy birthday to Eli.
No! That
Happy birthday to Eli.
Chowder man, no thanks.
Eli, happy birthday.
Who?
Yeah. Would you like to wish happy birthday to Eli?
I don't know who that guy is.
All right. Eli, happy birthday.
I was going to, and then I decided completely against it.
Would you like to wish Eloy a happy birthday?
I would. Eloy, happy birthday, Eloy, right? Eli? Eloy. No?
To you, happy birthday to you.
In 2018, Jamie Page and I started a live show on YouTube called The Mad Maker Show. We would go on to interview many well-known makers and a lot of interviews revealing intimate details and inspiration from makers. The show lasted 55 episodes, and on occasion we would have other guest hosts such as Doc Jared Hildebrandt, Mark Lindsay, CNC, and Matt Haas of Awesome Wood Things. During 2017, at some point, there was a conflict going in the Facebook groups, and splits occurred that changed a lot of ties between people. Personal squabbles over the content of posts, and it just created a fracture that was felt by all, really. During this time, Javi, Jamie, Chad, Patrick, Mark, David of Portal Woodworks, and Steve Nealon of Harneal Media, and others, would be on Hangouts in the afternoons and evenings. It was on these Hangouts that Makers Media Network was created. This is a good overview of how I connected with makers online, but it's not exhaustive. and a fair amount of details and interactions have been left out. But you have a good picture of the storyline, and I hope you enjoyed it.